In 1819, an aging artist, completely deaf and increasingly paranoid, began painting directly onto the walls of his house. What he created would become one of the most terrifying artworks in history. This is the story of Goya's Saturn Devouring His Son and the horrifying truth behind it. To understand the true horror of this painting, we need to start with where it was created. In 1819, an elderly Francisco Goya bought a two-story house on the outskirts of Madrid, known as the Quinta del Sordo, or Villa of the Deaf Man. This house would become the canvas for some of his most disturbing work. Imagine this: Goya, completely deaf and increasingly isolated from society, painting directly onto the walls of his home, not for any commission or public display, but purely for himself. The house itself tells us something crucial about Goya's state of mind. He had survived two near-fatal illnesses, witnessed the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, and seen his country torn apart by the Spanish Inquisition. Now in his 70s, he chose to surround himself with what would become known as the Black Paintings, 14 dark and haunting murals that would never be meant for public eyes. The painting draws from ancient Greek mythology, but Goya's interpretation is far from traditional. In the original myth, Saturn, known as Kronos to the Greeks, receives a prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him. His solution? Swallow each of his children whole as soon as they're born. It's already a dark tale, but the way Goya chose to depict it takes the horror to an entirely new level. Unlike earlier artistic interpretations, where Saturn calmly swallows his children whole, Goya's version shows something far more savage. His Saturn isn't just consuming his child, he's tearing it apart with wild-eyed abandon. The blood isn't neatly hidden away, it runs down Saturn's hands in vivid streaks. This isn't the calculated act of a god trying to prevent prophecy, this is pure primal violence. Let's really examine what makes this painting so viscerally disturbing. The figure of Saturn dominates the canvas, emerging from an impenetrable darkness. His eyes are the most striking feature. Bulging and crazed, they stare into nothingness with a mix of madness and terror. The god's hands dig into the flesh of his victim with such force that his knuckles turn white with strain. The victim's body is already partially consumed, the head and right arm are gone, and Saturn is about to take another bite from the left arm. But look at how Goya painted the remaining flesh. It glows with an almost ethereal whiteness against the darkness, making the violence even more stark and terrible. This isn't the dignified god of Roman mythology, this is a monster consumed by his own paranoid madness. What makes this painting truly terrifying goes beyond its graphic violence. Consider when Goya created it. He was in his 70s, deaf, isolated, and living in a Spain that was tearing itself apart. The painting can be read as a powerful metaphor for multiple horrors. Some interpret it as a representation of how power consumes its own children. Spain at the time was devouring its young in endless wars and revolutions. Goya had lost 5 of his 6 children. Only his son Javier survived to adulthood. The painting might reflect his own relationship with mortality and loss. Saturn was also the god of time, and the painting can be seen as a representation of how time eventually devours all things. The wild, unhinged look in Saturn's eyes might reflect Goya's fears about his own mental state as he aged in isolation. The technical aspects of the painting add another layer of horror. Goya painted it directly onto the walls of his house using a mixed technique that included oils. The rough, almost crude brushstrokes create a sense of urgency and violence. The limited palette, mostly blacks and grays with shocking splashes of red and white, makes the scene even more nightmarish. What's particularly interesting is how Goya uses light and shadow. The background is an absolute void of blackness, suggesting that this horrible act is taking place in some timeless, endless darkness. The only real light in the painting comes from the victim's flesh in the whites of Saturn's eyes, creating a terrible focus on the act of consumption. To To truly appreciate how revolutionary this painting was, we should compare it to earlier depictions of the same subject. Peter Paul Rubens' version of Saturn, painted about 200 years earlier, shows a much more classical controlled scene. His Saturn is muscular and godlike, the violence more stylized and less visceral. Goya completely breaks from this tradition. His Saturn isn't heroic or divine, he's a monster, more demon than god. This radical departure from classical representation wasn't just artistic rebellion. It represented a fundamental shift in how art could express psychological horror. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of this painting is that it was never meant to be seen by the public. When Goya left Spain for France in 1823, he simply left these paintings on the walls of his house. It wasn't until decades after his death that they were carefully transferred to canvas and eventually moved to the Prado Museum in Madrid. The fact that these were private works, painted purely for Goya's own purposes, makes them even more disturbing. They weren't created to shock an audience or make a public statement. They were the pure expression of whatever demons haunted Goya's mind in his final years. The influence of Saturn devouring his son on later artists can't be overstated. It presaged the psychological complexity of modern art by nearly a century. You can see its DNA in the works of expressionists, surrealists, and even contemporary horror artists. The way it depicts psychological trauma through physical violence has become a blueprint for visual storytelling about mental anguish. The painting's power lies not just in its grotesque subject matter, but in how it collapses the distance between classical mythology and raw human experience. It transforms an ancient tale into something immediately, viscerally present. What makes this painting endure isn't just its shocking violence, it's how it speaks to universal human fears. The fear of being consumed by forces beyond our control. The terror of time's relentless march. The horror of watching power destroy innocence. These themes resonate just as strongly today as they did in Goya's time. When we look at Saturn's crazed eyes, we're not just seeing a mythological figure. We're seeing a reflection of human nature's darkest potential. The painting forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, fear, and the capacity for violence that lurks within civilization's thin veneer. In the end, what makes Saturn devouring his son truly terrifying isn't just its graphic content. It's the layers of meaning and the window it provides into both individual and collective human darkness. It's a painting that becomes more disturbing the longer you look at it and the more you understand its context. Goya created something that transcends traditional horror. This isn't just a painting of a mythological scene, it's a glimpse into the abyss of human nature. It's a work that continues to resonate because it speaks to timeless fears and anxieties that we all carry within us. When you look at this painting, remember, you are not just seeing a monster devouring his child. You're seeing a master artist's unflinching portrayal of power, fear, madness, and the darkness that can consume us all. And that's what makes it truly terrifying, not just what it shows us about Saturn, but what it reveals about ourselves. The more you understand about this painting, the more disturbing it becomes, which really makes you wonder, what other dark secrets are hiding in plain sight in the art world? If you found this deep dive fascinating, you are definitely going to want to stick around for our next video, where we'll be exploring another mysterious masterpiece that changed art history forever. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. And hey, I'm really curious. What do you think is the most disturbing aspect of this painting? Is it the raw violence, the psychological implications, or maybe the fact that Goya painted this just for himself? Let me know in the comments below.